You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. The Rewilding Earth podcast is supported by businesses such as Patagonia, Catula, and Biohabitats, as well as the Whedon Foundation and listeners like you. If you love the work that the Rewilding Institute is doing, please consider donating at rewilding.org. And be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter while you're there. David Brower, then executive director of the Sierra Club, gave a talk at Dartmouth College in 1965 on the threat of dams to Grand Canyon National Park. John Miles, a New Hampshire native who had not yet been to the American West, was flabbergasted. "What can I do?" he asked. Brower handed him a Sierra Club membership application, and he was hooked. His first big conservation issue being establishment of North Cascades National Park. After grad school at the University of Oregon, John landed in Bellingham, Washington, a month before the park was created. At Western Washington University, he was in on the founding of Huxley College of Environmental Studies, teaching environmental education, history, ethics, and literature, ultimately serving as dean of the college. He taught at Huxley for 44 years, climbing and hiking all over the West, especially in the North Cascades. Author and editor of several books, including Wilderness in National Parks, John served on the board of the National Parks Conservation Association, the Washington Forest Practices Board, and helped found and build the North Cascades Institute. Retired and now living near Taos, New Mexico, he continues to work for national parks, wilderness, and rewilding the earth. We start today by asking John about the Charles Dingell Jr. Conservation Management and Recreation Act, or what we've been referring to as simply the new Wilderness Bill.
Well, I'm really excited about it. I think it's an important moment in conservation history. We've been struggling for quite a while to try to get a major public lands bill through Congress, and that wasn't going to happen. All the Republicans had complete control. Although I must say that in this case, this is a bipartisan bill, and they've been working on it for a number of years. And finally, the conditions seem to have been right for it to actually pass. And it passed in the Senate by something like 92-7. So this is a real exciting moment in this whole business. It's called the John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation Management and Recreation Act. And Nancy Pelosi put the Dingell name on it to recognize this longtime conservationist who recently passed away. And it's really a huge bill. And it's got many things in it. It's like 640 pages long. But one of the things that it has in it is that it protects 1.3 million acres of wilderness. It adds to the wilderness preservation system in a big way, including 273,000 acres down here in New Mexico. And also there's a bunch of other issues that have been boiling out there that this resolves somewhat. It withdraws something in the order of 370,000 acres of land from mining around two national parks. And those two national parks are Yellowstone and the North Cascades. I certainly know the North Cascades very well. And there was a proposal to put in an open pit mine in the upper reaches of the Methow Valley right next to the North Cascades National Park. And this is the kind of thing that people have been working on for years, and finally it's being resolved. So that's just one of the many things that's in the bill.
What does it mean in New Mexico for, talk a little bit about the 273,000 acres. It's not all contiguous, right? So what's the most important part of that for you?
Well, the most directly important part for us here is that right here in the Rio Grande del Norte National Monument, there are two wilderness units that will be declared through this legislation. And those are a couple of the outstanding peaks that are here, the Cerro de la Yuta and over by the San Antonio Mountain. So this adds a wilderness component to this relatively new national monument, the Rio Grande del Norte. And then, of course, the Organ Mountains, the largest wilderness components are down in the Organ Mountains, which are down on the southern border of New Mexico. And that was pretty contentious, the idea that the Organ Mountains National Monument would be established in the first place. And now that it's going to be protected, much of it as wilderness, is a huge step forward in terms of protecting some of the really beautiful landscapes here in New Mexico.
How old is the national monument status for that area?
Well, it was in 2013. So it's very recent. The fight's been going
Oh,
on, as I understand it, for a long time.
wow. So that is very, very recent. And then it just gets flipped over into wilderness in 5 years later, potentially. So,
Yes.
wow. That's pretty good. Why is that area
Well,
so
I know.
important?
It's right down there on the border, for one thing. It's a spectacularly beautiful area. The mountains there they're stark, but they're steep and precipitous and just beautiful. So it's an area that has a lot of potential to attract tourism for that region of New Mexico. It's, as I say, along the boundary and is rugged enough that I don't think they're going to build a wall through there. But anyway, it's an area that's got lots of values, and it's great that after all these years, it's finally going to be protected. And of course, also, I think this points out that in these public land issues, they tend to be so contentious that it takes decades often for them to be achieved. And so that's nothing unusual in respect to these New Mexico areas.
What do you think? What's everybody saying? What's the buzz? Or what do you think personally the chances are that this is going to get signed?
Well, from what I read, that they think it's going to be signed, and if it isn't signed, the majorities were so overwhelming in both the Senate and the House that it could probably be a veto override. So, but I don't think that's like that. I think Trump will sign it. He's doing a lot of the damage on other fronts, but in something that's so overwhelmingly supported by bipartisan representatives in Congress, I don't think he can not afford not to at this point.
Now, how did this happen? I mean, I know you follow the news like everybody else on the more general issues at hand. How in the world did wilderness, which is usually as contentious an issue as anything else when it's not the contentious issues we're dealing with now, why the heck did this turn out to be so bipartisan? And why in your mind aren't people talking about, hey, even if you don't care about wilderness or conservation or anything, look, these guys actually worked together. That seems like a huge news story, like breaking news.
Well, it is. It really is. And I think it's a consequence in no small part of the fact that Maria Cantwell, Senator Cantwell from the state of Washington, and Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, Cantwell's a Democrat, Murkowski's a Republican, that they get the credit, as I understand it, for really pursuing this kind of a bipartisan agreement. And it's a compromise. I mean, there are things in it that conservationists don't like. And such as what's happening up there in Alaska and the coastal plain and so on and so forth. But it's a compromise, and so everybody gets a little something. And it's also been referred to by some as another sort of a park barrel bill. You know, there's something in it for almost everybody in the country. Conservation issues that have been sitting on the burner for so long that finally some action needed to be taken. For instance, one of the things that may have pushed this bill further than anything is the fact that the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which was established back in the 1960s to fund public land acquisition projects, whether they be from playgrounds and baseball diamonds in cities to wilderness areas, it ended last fall, and they wanted to renew it. And this is a bill that would do that, and it would fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund permanently, as I understand it. What the Land and Water Conservation Fund does is it takes the money that is acquired through offshore oil and gas leasing, and it allocates it, or some of it, to the recreation and conservation causes in this country. And so it's been a critically important part of the conservation story since the 1960s. So they really needed and wanted to renew this because almost every probably congressional district in the country has one or another project that they want to have funded. So that's one of the things I think that probably precipitated the final action to bring this to the floor and get it passed and hopefully to get it signed and put into effect.
I know everybody's in a state of emergency and everybody defines that a little bit differently on the edges, but in the core, I think we all feel like we're a little bit in a state of emergency. And I guess I can forgive that. Maybe it's unfair for me to bring it up and harp on this issue, but part of that state of emergency, I think that most people would agree on, is that Congress can't get anything done. And here they've gotten something really done. So I went out and just refreshed on Google my memory of the places I think I saw one of them was the Washington Post article, which says sweeping new conservation bill shows Congress is not completely broken after all. And it just strikes me as weird because I monitor social media for rewilding and I see all these headlines and they fly by so fast you sometimes forget. Was there ever a buzz about this? And so, yes, there were the usual players like Washington Post and others that put the article out there. And I think the authors of those expected even this is a really big deal. Just any demonstration whatsoever at this point in our history, political divisiveness and everything that's going on, that they can demonstrate anytime that they've done anything together at all. And this is a really big one. It's not like they worked on a little bill that was pretty inconsequential that anybody could agree on. This has got contentious things in it.
Well, I think one of the reasons that it may not be very high on many Americans' radars these days is there's so much political noise out there. Every day the noise seems to stay at a very high volume relative to Trump and all the issues that are involved with him and his scandals and so on and so forth. So it sort of flies under the news radar. There are going to be people whose areas are going to be in one way or another conserved. One of the biggest victories from a conservation standpoint is over in Utah, where the politics of conservation are about as contentious as they are anywhere. So in Utah's Emery County, they are going to designate 661,000 acres of wilderness there, another 300,000 acres for a national recreation area it's called the San Rafael Recreation Area, and protect 63 miles of the Green River. These are things that those people over there in Utah have been battling for decades. I mean, I'm new to the Southwest, relatively new, but when I lived up in the Pacific Northwest, I would read consistently about the contentious battles that were going on in Utah over trying to protect some of those spectacular Utah wildlands, the Red Rock country, and so on. And this bill does this. This is going to make the news because this is, I think, a really big deal.
And I hope that it's right when we see him sign this bill, that's going to be the turning point where the really big fireworks go off, because people should know about this. They should be extremely proud of it. I'm hoping it's a catalyst for a larger discussion that we've been craving for so long.
Well, one of the things that I think makes this newsworthy is that this is a time when the Trump administration is really mounting quite a number of attacks on the public lands, whether it be oil and gas leasing all across the West here, or the oil exploration on the North Slope up there in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge,
shrinking monuments,
and all the deregulation that's going on the environmental front, reducing the monuments. I mean, that's the other side of the story over in Utah, that Bears Ears has been reduced by like 80%, and there's the Grand Staircase Escalante has been reduced by about half, and that remains to be seen whether or not that actually is a permanent deal. It's in court now and probably will be for some time.
But how many things do you think are sitting out there right now in that state of suspended animation, that they're in the court system and our groups are just locking that stuff up for as long as they possibly can to weather this storm?
Well, I think there's a great many of the actions that have been taken that are held up that way. I mean, they may not be held up necessarily. I know, for instance, over there in Bears Ears, the BLM is going ahead and developing management plans for the reduced monument and so on. So I think there's quite a few of these things that are actually going to, they've been significantly slowed down in terms of their impact on the land itself. And we'll see whether or not, if this administration is a one-term administration, then I think that we will see a significant overturning of these rules and regulations and decisions that have been made, overturning what was done before by the Obama administration, even back to the Clinton administration. So I think you're right. I think that's one of the tactics that the conservation community has had to use, not only the conservation community, but even the outdoor recreation community, for instance, led by the Outdoor Industry Association and companies like Patagonia that have filed lawsuits in some of these cases, because everyone recognizes that, in fact, the long-term health of the economies of many of these Western areas that are in contention will benefit greatly over the long term from outdoor recreation, more so than from a resource extraction, whether it be uranium or coal or whatever the case might be that the extractors are trying to achieve.
We call you lovingly, the board and staff at Rewilding, John Scholar. And you've earned that title because you get books shipped to you in giant boxes of scores of books at a time to review and to report on at rewilding.org. I've been in your library and there's a thing going on with you. So I always look to people like you. If anybody can sort out patterns of things that are happening, things that are going on, it's the people who are really sticking to putting your ear to the ground as you do. I mean, you read an awful lot of stuff. I don't know how you get through it all and review it all. And it's a mystery, I think, to all of us. But we love that you're there. And that's one of the big things that you do for Rewilding. What are the patterns that you're seeing in terms of conservation, in terms of current political situation? I know I'm throwing something at you that's weird because this is a complete outlier. Like there's no pattern to what we're experiencing right now, but it is part of a pattern. If you just look at what we're doing now, it's like crazy. But do you think there's a groundswell building up here that is going to be, you know, how the pendulum always swings back almost exactly 100% the way the other direction? Well, this is certainly going to happen at some point. It's going to swing back. What do you think's in our future?
Well, here's the story from my perspective, is that each time that there is an assault on public lands, going all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, then conservationists emerge in response. I mean, for instance, this was very obvious in the 1980s during the Reagan administration, when there was a Secretary of Interior, Watt at the time, who at that time, the Reagan administration was trying to increase the extraction of oil and gas and other things from the environment. And what happened was, of course, the conservation and environmental community grew ever more large and active in response. Now, we're only 2 years into the current administration here, which is probably mounting an assault on public lands that is in many respects worse even than Reagan or some of the other predecessors, than Bush, certainly. And it's maybe still too early to tell for sure whether or not the similar reaction in the community will occur, but I think it will. I mean, I think what's going to happen, when things are good, let's say they were good during the Jimmy Carter administration, and then people got a little bit complacent, and then the Reagan administration came along and they started to do all kinds of things to the public land system that the conservation community didn't like, and it may have taken 4, 5, 6 years for that response to occur, but it did. And then we got into the Clinton years, which were pretty good, and there was more, once again, maybe a little bit more complacency amongst the conservationists. And then the same thing with the Bush administration. They started to tackle some of the more oil and gas exploration and leasing and so on and so forth. And then came Obama, and maybe a little bit of complacency again. But here we are. So, but that's a pattern. I mean, you asked about a pattern. I see that pattern going way back in American history, and I expect that that's going to occur again. That indeed, we're going to see a kind of an uprising, a revitalization, and maybe this public lands bill is an indicator of that, where people are going to begin to recognize, hey, those are my lands out there. I'm an owner of the public domain. There's 644 million acres in the United States that I am an owner of, that I hold in common with the other people in this country. And I don't want these people who are bent only on extracting wealth from that land to overwhelm my values and my interests in those public lands. So I think that's what's going to happen.
The whole time you're talking, I'm thinking about coyotes. When biologists first discovered that when we put pressure on coyotes, they double their litter sizes, it makes me feel like you're kind of describing us as coyotes. And when things are good, the litter sizes drop, and when they're bad, the litter sizes double or triple, and that feels good to me. In a weird way, though, but I don't like the complacency thing. I don't want this to wear off. In fact, we can't really afford for this time for it to wear off like it did in the good years, for the complacency to come back, because we're on a longer mission that has absolutely no consideration for the length of an administration's reign. It's a much more dire and urgent situation. I mean, maybe I'm not seeing the pattern, but am I correct? Are people correct when they say we're in the most dire situation that we have ever been in before? It's not like the old fights. It's not like the times where all we had to worry about was wilderness. Now we're talking about wilderness juxtaposed with its ability to store carbon, because we're all freaking out about climate change. And it's not just wilderness in terms of cores and buffers and corridors for the ability for wildlife to move around to protect biodiversity for biodiversity's sake. We also have to lace every conversation with how it's going to affect in any good positive way climate change. Now we're in this situation. Does that affect the pattern at all? Do you see us building something that can be sustained this time, and that complacency doesn't come back in because the next administration won't outlive the dire consequences that scientists are saying we're facing, and we're already facing, for climate change?
Well, I think you make an excellent point there, really. Yeah. There is this pattern that I mentioned, but truly we are in a different situation right now. I mean, we've never faced anything quite like in many ways, I think, existential crisis of climate change, because it is just going to affect virtually everything in modern life. I mean, for instance, one of the things that I see relative to all these migrations across the world now is changing climate. It's going to change the ability of the planet in large areas to support the populations that live there. And not only that, but I started as a college teacher back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, talking about human population. And over the 45 or so years that I talked about it, the human population more than doubled. So not only do we have climate change, but we have an overwhelmingly huge and rapidly growing global population. So those issues are huge, hard to deal with, because, for many people who go about their daily lives, making a living and raising their kids and this sort of thing, those global issues are almost too large to even think about, let alone decide what you can do about it. And so, it's a different time.
It's odd that there are some places that we fought really hard to protect that got protected specifically for species that relied on that area. And we thought, yay, we got it protected. This species is covered. But we never thought about climate change and the fact that it was going to change the area that we protected such that that species couldn't live in there anymore and would need to move to an unprotected area to have a chance at the same habitat that they've come to rely on through evolution and millions of years. It used to be a static environment. We need this wilderness area or this connectivity or whatever. We need this protected because there's a species here that relies very specifically on this area. And then now the area is shifting. The climate is different. The weather patterns are different. And it's making it very difficult for that species we tried so hard to protect to live there anymore.
Well, you talk about all this reading that I get to do. And in fact, I'd have to say that the idea of a static environment has went away in the scientific world, I don't know, 50, 60 years ago, because ecologists began to recognize that there's really no steady state. Everything is constantly in change, in flux for one reason or another.
Mm-hmm.
Trees grow, die, and wildfires come through, various disturbances occur. So it's a constant process of change. But I think in this case, what I'm seeing now is that at least in the scientific literature and in some of the what you might call general environmental literature that I see, people are writing more and more about the consequences of the way in which we have constructed our society and our civilizations. For instance, one of the books that I read this last fall as part of my judging role in the National Outdoor Book Awards is a book titled Rising. And in that, it's about sea level rise. And one of the points that she makes in that book is that we have sort of like hardened a lot of the seashores. And so there's no place for plants and animals that live along the coast to move inland because they're blocked by, development, seawalls, all that kind of thing. A lot of the critters that need to live in a cooler climate as the climate warms, they could maybe like pikas go up the mountain, but up to the point where there's no further elevation gain to go and they're done. I mean, there's potential there. And there's just a lot of recognition of this across the thoughtful community that is wrestling with, okay, how do we adapt? It doesn't look like we're going to be able to stop climate change and global warming because we're not responding to the challenge across the world. So how are we going to adapt to it? And not only we, but how are all of the other organisms that we share the environment with going to adapt to it? And so this is a whole new conversation that's beginning to get more and more attention among writers and scientists, and maybe not yet politicians, but I'm sure sooner or later that will probably come.
Amid all of these things, what is it that gives you hope right now? What are you hopeful about?
Well, I think that relative to public lands, which is what we started to talk about in the first place, was that the more of us there are, nobody's making any more land. So what we need to do is we need to conserve and preserve more of the land that has yet to be, in a healthy condition, that hasn't been paved over or maybe severely overgrazed or impacted by oil and gas leasing, that kind of thing. And I think that we started out talking about the Dingell Conservation Management and Recreation Act and the bipartisan support for it. And to me, that's a very hopeful sign that in the United States here, at least, we have this long history of conservation, of the recognition that we need to protect the natural world upon which we depend. In fact, the conservation movement really got a big start back in the late 19th century, when people recognized that we were cutting our forests down at such a rapid rate that if we didn't do something to slow it down, we were going to be in trouble. We were not going to have the kind of water supplies that we needed, and we wouldn't have a timber supply. Maybe we would have a timber crisis whereby we didn't have those resources anymore. And this country was trying to expand and grow, and it needed a long-term sustained supply of natural resources in order to do so. So the conservation movement began. And I think that it's continued with ups and downs for over a century. And this event that's happening with this Conservation Act that's just has just gone through Congress is an indication that people are recognizing that we need to act in order to enjoy a positive and sustainable future on the land.
John, I know we're going to have a lot of conversations. We do anyway, but I'd like to have them more in public like this because you're an inspiration and a constant fount of information historically and elsewise. So thank you so much for taking the time to be on Rewilding Earth today.
Well, thank you, and I'm happy to do it anytime.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. Be sure to visit rewilding.org to subscribe so you don't miss past and future episodes. And while you're there, please consider supporting Rewilding by making a donation or subscribing to the Rewilding Earth newsletter.